Okay, so markets. What are they and how do they work? Where do they do well and where do they create problems? I'm going to give a brief summary of these issues today. Okay, let's jump straight in with the definition of a few key terms. First, what is a market? At its most basic level, a market is a system in which goods and services are exchanged. Now, generally in a modern market, people use money as a medium of exchange, which leads to the formation of prices. That is, simply put, a monetary value which can be assigned to each of the things exchanged. Now, you can see here I have a quote on the screen, which I think is quite a good summary of what a market is. And there are two aspects of it that I really wanted to emphasize. Markets are usually thought to involve voluntary transactions or exchanges based on the preferences of the parties involved in the exchange. So I might propose, for example, that I trade my pen for your pen, on the basis that I would prefer your pen to mine. If you consider this and then voluntarily agree to the transaction, we can assume that you do this because you also prefer my pen to yours. Once we complete the exchange then, we are both better off. I now have something that I prefer and you have something that you prefer. In this way, a market exchange is said to produce mutual benefit. If we can agree on a deal that we are both happy with, we will both end up better off. And this takes place without either of us worrying what is best for the other person. All we're focusing on here is our own preferences. So before we delve into this in more detail, I have one more term I would like to define, and that is a commodity. A commodity is a good or service that is offered for exchange on the market. So a thing that can be bought or sold. So let's turn back to the concept of a market and how it is supposed to work. We've already established the idea that a market is supposed to involve mutually beneficial exchange. But how does this work on a larger scale? Let's say, for example, you're a baker and you're trying to sell your bread on the free, unregulated market. Let's say it costs 50 cents to make a loaf of bread. You think €1 would be a good price to sell at, but no one's coming to buy. Then you realize there's another baker down the street selling loaves of bread for 75 cents. So you lower your price to 74 cents. Now, under this system, the buyers are clearly better off because there is an incentive to keep prices down to make the transaction attractive to them. You, on the other hand, now know how much bread it costs to produce and how much you can sell it for. So you have all the information you need to work out how much profit you can make. You wouldn't even need to go down the road and check the prices at the other bakery. You could just lower your prices by 5 cents every day until people start to buy your bread. As long as there is a free flow of information, that is, customers know who is selling bread and for what prices, they will seek you out when your prices drop to the right level. If the bread costs 50 cents to make for everyone, then the price will always remain above this, because everyone needs to make a profit. And if the price somehow drops below 50 cents, you could either go and sell something else, or you can work out how people are producing the bread so cheaply and lower your production costs. Now, if there's a huge demand for bread and all existing bakeries just keep selling out, you might be able to raise your prices significantly. But now there is an incentive for other bakers to open up stores and produce more bread to meet this demand, which will drive prices back down through additional supply and competition. This naturally leads to what economists call allocative efficiency. Resources and activities can be allocated, that is, put towards producing something, in a way that ensures exactly the right amount of various types of things are produced, depending on what people are willing to buy and how much money they have. Resources can be put towards the products that people want in a much more efficient way than if this was planned by someone who could not possibly have all the complex information to determine what people want and at what price. Now, this is often referred to as the invisible hand. Basically, everyone just working on the free market to satisfy their own preferences or maximize their own profits will produce a system in which everything is distributed in an efficient way. More efficient than if someone was trying to work out how to distribute things from the top down. But we can go even further than this. Many advocates of the unregulated free market contend not just that this is a good way of coordinating activity, but it is the optimal or best possible way. As we've already seen, the idea behind a market exchange is that it is only voluntarily undertaken when both parties are made better off by the exchange. If you let everyone just freely make whichever exchanges they want, you will eventually reach an equilibrium where no further mutually beneficial exchanges can happen. At this point, no one can be made better off without someone else being made worse off. This is known in economics as the condition of Pareto optimality. All commodities have been distributed in a way that leads to the maximum satisfaction of preferences without taking anything away from anyone. So this all sounds great. Now let's look at where some problems come in. All the advantages that I've just spoken about depend on the market being in an ideal state, which involves markets meeting several conditions. In real-life markets, there can be problems achieving these conditions. First, as I've already mentioned, an ideal market needs a free flow of information. Although no actor in the market needs all possible information, they do require some information, which they might not be able to gain access to. For example, I mentioned that if the price of a loaf of bread drops below what it costs the baker to make it, the baker needs to find out how other bakers are producing it more cheaply. But this is obviously the sort of thing that rival bakers would want to keep secret. And there might be other problems accessing this information. Maybe it is restricted by patents, or maybe it is somehow just too costly to obtain. Buyers can also lack important information about, for example, the existence of alternative products, or about the quality and performance of products. Secondly, an ideal market needs to involve strong and robust competition in order to make sure, firstly, that an adequate supply of a commodity is achieved, and also to drive down prices. But it might not be in the seller's interests to compete with each other. If all the suppliers of a certain product band together in what is known as a cartel, they can make an agreement that they will keep prices artificially high, much higher than they would be if they were competing against each other. There is clearly an incentive for them to do this if they can get away with it. Also, if a particular company has a concentration of economic power, it might be able to drive out all competition and create a monopoly. A company might have unique access to certain materials, for example, preventing anyone else from producing a certain product. Or they might grow big enough to allow them to produce goods at a lower price than any competitor, so no one else can enter the market. The third reason that markets might not be as efficient as their proponents suggest is because of what is known as externalities or neighborhood effects. These are basically side effects of an activity that have either a positive or negative effect on others. I'm going to focus on negative externalities here. Basically, the problem here is that companies have an incentive to maximize their profits. This means maximizing the difference between the price at which things are sold and the price that it costs to produce them. One way this can be achieved is by lowering production costs. But one way that companies can reduce their own production costs is to push the costs onto others. The most commonly discussed example of this is pollution. It might lower a company's production costs, for example, to dump toxic chemicals into a river rather than disposing of them safely. But this clearly imposes costs onto others. Resources might need to be invested to make the water fit for drinking, for example, or into the medical care for those who are exposed to the toxins. So the overall costs introduced into the system might be much more significant than if the company had just disposed of the chemicals properly in the first place. But they have no incentive to do this. In fact, they have an incentive to do anything to lower their prices, no matter what costs this introduces into the system as a whole. The next problem for free markets is the public goods problem. Public goods are basically goods that cannot be restricted to paying customers. If they are made available, there is no way to stop people that don't pay for them from benefiting from them as well. Imagine, for example, a street light. If you install a street light, there's no way to stop people in the vicinity of it from benefiting from the light it produces, whether they paid for it or not. This leads to the free rider problem, which in turn leads to companies having a lower incentive to produce these public goods. For example, imagine a national defense system, which people pay for on a purely voluntary basis. Because you know that as long as enough people pay to keep the system going, you will be protected by it, even if you don't pay. The rational, self-interested decision would just be not to pay. Just let other people pay for it, you will benefit anyway. But everyone else is faced with exactly the same choice. And if enough people come to the same conclusion, the whole system will collapse. It seems difficult to sustain these public goods without requiring that people contribute to them. This is a problem for efficiency because it means that sort of a free, unregulated market has low incentives to produce public goods, where they can't ensure that all people will pay. But producing these public goods might, in some cases, be an efficient use of resources and an efficient means of preference satisfaction. But there is also just a more explicitly moral argument here. Typically, we value certain public goods and we want to see them produced. And it looks like this might only happen to a very limited extent if we leave everything up to the market. Now, these are all arguments to suggest that real markets have problems achieving optimal efficiency. Either real-life markets don't meet the conditions, like a free flow of information or robust competition that allow them to operate efficiently, or they operate efficiently in certain areas, with high incentives to produce more costs to the system and low incentives to produce benefits for the system. I'd like to finish up here by briefly looking at some more explicitly moral problems with markets. Arguments against using markets in certain contexts that are not about efficiency. So first, some argue that in some areas, markets simply won't achieve the outcomes that we want. Even if we accept that markets are the best way of producing and distributing goods efficiently, we might not only value efficiency in certain areas. Let's take, for example, healthcare. We might say, what's more important than having the lowest costs possible is that healthcare is distributed according to need, rather than according to who can pay for it. Or imagine, for example, jury duty. Imagine a society where you can buy and sell your obligation to sit on a jury. On one level, this seems quite attractive. People who really need the money could get paid, let's say, 100 euros to sit on a jury. They need and want that money, so they're happy. People who would rather not do it, on the other hand, could just pay to get out of it. People get to choose what they would rather have, the time or the money. So in terms of mutual benefit and preference satisfaction, this all seems great. But what would the societal consequences of this be? Juries would end up stacked with poor people. But the point of a jury is to represent a random subsection of society. As we've seen in the countries that have this is necessary to achieving justice. If we allow people to buy and sell this, the overall societal function of a jury is undermined. A second problem here is exploitation and coercion. The idea that we can engage in voluntary exchanges seems to assume that we are in the position to make voluntary decisions. But this might not always be the case. If you are desperately poor and I offer you 50,000 euros for one of your kidneys, you might feel as if you have no choice but to take the money. Some people argue that offering the option to sell your kidney effectively forces you to take that option, and therefore we shouldn't allow it. A third common argument against markets in certain areas or against turning certain things into commodities is that putting a price on some things corrupts and diminishes their value. A common example here is prostitution. Some people argue that putting a monetary value on sex degrades all the other sort of important societal meanings that we attach to it. But they also argue that allowing markets into areas like this encourages what we call market creep. It can basically lead to us thinking about all sex or all personal interactions in transactional terms, and this could undermine our ability to have meaningful relationships at all. So the problem here is often not just with the practice itself, but how it creeps into and affects other areas. Now, we've seen this alluded to in this week's reading by Michael Sandel. But as was pointed out in the forums today by Lisa Hoffman, we might really question how much this market creep is actually a problem. After all, prostitution has been around for a very long time, but still we seem to have retained the ability to have meaningful relationships. So it's really an open question here how much this is actually a problem, and it will probably really depend on the specific thing that we're looking at here. Okay, so this gives you an overview of the problems that philosophers tend to focus on when they talk about markets. Of course, there are many other issues that could be raised here. These arguments are all based on the assumption, and most of the readings will be based on the same assumption, which is widely held in many Western countries, that markets can do some things really well, but that they might require regulation, and there might be certain areas in which they should not operate for various reasons. There are many other philosophical aspects of markets that we could focus on. We could spend a whole semester, for example, talking about ideas of justice, or about Marx's more radical and fundamental critique of some of these practices. We will touch on both of these issues over the course, but unfortunately we just don't have enough time to cover everything in depth. So I think that's all I have to cover today. Next week, we'll be looking at some moral arguments for a free market, not just efficiency-based arguments, but arguments about protecting our fundamental rights and encouraging freedom. We'll also start to delve into public goods problems and problems concerning externalities. So for next week, make sure to do the reading, to post a question about it to the forum by Tuesday, and you can check back in on Wednesday for the next video. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.